Let's start with the basics.
Some of the things that you wrote in this book are really contradictory to what we're hearing in most schools and media.
As population of the world grows, things are becoming cheaper. Things are becoming more abundant rather than less abundant.
Okay, that is literally the opposite of what I hear everywhere.
There's 8 billion of us, and compared to people in 1800, we are incredibly rich. Where is the data showing there is an existential crisis coming out of climate change? Because they are not looking for a solution. For them, environmentalism, it's a replacement for a religion.
Marian, the first time I heard about your work was when I saw this book about 10 global trends that are supposed to make us happy and grateful to be living in these times. And so actually I ordered like 50 of them and I've been handing them out to a lot of my friends. And this was before I even knew your name. I was like, oh, let's give the happiness book to people, right? Like the gratitude book to people. And so I'm so glad to actually have this conversation with you because I have a lot of questions specifically about some of the charts in here. But you later on produced a quite controversial book, Superabundance, which really is why I want to sit down and talk to you, because some of the things that you wrote in this book are things that are really contradictory to what we're hearing in most schools and media. And explain to me a little bit what you mean by superabundance and what is this new book about?
The book really tries to answer one important question. If you get more people in the world, are resources going to become less abundant or are they going to become more abundant? Okay, because when you have more people consuming stuff, things are supposed to become scarcer, more expensive, right? We live on a finite planet after all. But when we actually did the numbers, when we looked at the facts, what we realized that as population of the world grows, things are becoming cheaper. Things are becoming more abundant rather than less abundant. And so the book is really about the relationship between population growth and abundance. And what we are claiming is that on average, every additional human being contributes more than they consume. They contribute new knowledge, new innovations, new ideas, which then make everything more abundant, everything cheaper. And that is why we have these massive improvements in standards of living.
Okay, that is literally the opposite of what I hear everywhere. And so I actually pulled out this clip from Bill Maher, who would probably think that your brain is flat, as you'll hear from his commentary here. And so I want to give you a chance to actually react to Bill Maher and this clip. So let's watch this clip and let's react to it. And it was not me who calls you a flat brain. It was Bill Maher.
That informed us that in November of this year, the population of the Earth will hit 8 billion is not good news. And those who regard it as such should be treated for TikTok brain.
Oh, TikTok brain. You have a TikTok brain.
The Secretary General of the United Nations, of all people, said that welcoming our 8 billionth person was an occasion to celebrate our diversity. Yes, what a comfort that people of all races will be contributing to an already unsustainable carbon footprint and choking and starving equally. Have you seen what has been happening with the climate in recent years? Did you see England last week? England is pretty far north, but the runways are melting. Our farmland is shrinking due to scorching temperatures and drought. 1 out of 4 people on Earth is food insecure, what we used to call hungry. There's another one. And billions face some form of water scarcity. Water isn't the only thing we're running out of. Clean air, quality soil, rainforests, wetlands, the precious metals that make our phones work. Tracy Stone Manning is our director of the Bureau of Land Management, and she said, if there were fewer of us, we would have less impact. We must consume less, and more importantly, we must breed fewer consuming humans. Yes, I thought this was a duh. And until very recently, it was. But now there's a growing movement of people more worried about population decline. Decline, that's what we should be celebrating. But Elon Musk says,
the biggest problem the world will face in 20 years is population collapse.
But I have no idea what he's talking about when he says Earth could sustain many times its current population and the ecosystem would be fine. It's not fine now.
Okay, so Bill Maher is certainly funny, but is he correct?
I agree with you. Bill Maher is very funny. He's a highly intelligent person. But almost all highly intelligent people in the world are usually right on a lot of things, and they can be wrong on some things. That is his big failing. He's a Malthusian through and through, always has been. He's always been concerned about quote-unquote overpopulation, and he's simply wrong on that. 90% of what he said was wrong. There were some things where we can talk about it, but let's start with the basics. Are we running out of water? You go on Amazon, you can find a dozen books about future wars being fought over water within minutes, maybe even seconds on being on Amazon. Absolute nonsense. 73% of the planet is covered by water. It just happens to be the wrong kind of water. It's salt water. But to take salt water and turn it into fresh water that you can drink, all you need is a desalination plant. So when the cost of water becomes very expensive, because we are going to run out, we're going to start running out, and therefore it will rise in price, we are just going to build many more desalination plants, which can be powered by nuclear power, which doesn't emit any CO2 into the atmosphere, which can be powered by solar panels or wind or whatever. And we are going to be able to turn salt water into fresh water and therefore have plenty of water for billions of people today and in the future. Israel, perfect example, very little fresh water reserves. They have a lot of desalination plants. They recycle 98% of their water, which means that Israel is not only an exporter of agricultural produce. Israel, this tiny little country without water, is actually producing enough food for export, but actually they supply fresh water to the surrounding Arab states, with many of which they have very poor relations. So that tells you what happens when you combine human ingenuity with a problem. You come up with a solution and then you solve it. Similarly, when it comes to land, are we having too much impact on land? Well, yes, but that impact has peaked about 20 years ago and is now declining. Why? Because we are able to grow ever more food on fewer acres of land. Obviously, in the past, when our technology and our understanding of the natural world was very primitive, we needed a lot of acres of land to produce enough food to feed a much smaller population. But now our yields of corn and wheat and barley and whatever else per acre of land has exploded exponentially, so that we can grow more food on smaller acreage of land, and we are able to return that land back to nature. We have smart agriculture, which allows you to know exactly how much water each plant needs because it has a tiny little microchip attached to it. We have artificial fertilizers, so we no longer have to rely on human or animal excrement in order to increase the yield. And we have actually, right now, the big thing is to start producing food in cities, in these glass skyscrapers, where you can produce them actually vertically with very little soil, and it's mostly water. They're called hydroponics. So there's a lot of innovation that is going on in the world in terms of food production, in terms of the entire environmental picture. The big mistake that Bill makes, the lesson that he hasn't learned, is that human beings are fundamentally different from other animals. Other animals, when the times are good, you have a lot of food, they eat a lot, they procreate a lot, they consume everything around them, and then the population collapses. But we are not just consumers. We are a different type of animal. We are innovators. We are long-term planners. We have reason. We are able to create processes, improve our productivity in such a way that we can get more food from less land, more food with fewer inputs, more food at a cheaper cost. And we've been doing this for a very long time.
But wouldn't he say, and people like him say, that still more population means robbing the earth from its resources? We're still, more population, still using more of Earth's resources, more land, creating a larger carbon footprint, which apparently is something that they're very concerned about. What's your answer to that?
What does it mean to be using resources? The same resources which caveman had, we have. They are still here. For now, steel may be trapped in high-rise buildings, but if suddenly we couldn't produce any more steel, we could still extract steel from those buildings, meaning all the resources that we need are still here. Some of them are being used, but they can be reused. All you need is new knowledge to take the atoms which we are currently using in a certain way and reuse them in a different way. A perfect example of that would be something like lithium. Now that so many cars are becoming electric cars, you can't open a newspaper without somebody freaking out about what will happen when we run out of lithium.
Right.
Who is to say that in 10 years' time or 20 years' time, we are going to be needing lithium in order to power our electric vehicles? Maybe it will be sodium, which right now they are working on. Now, sodium is just salt, which is also a byproduct of desalination when you turn salt water into fresh water. So the problem here, I think, is the problem of not understanding that within economics, you very often come across substitutes. You're using something in order to accomplish a goal. Let's say you kill a lot of whales in order to extract their fat, in order to burn candles. And then you project into the future and think, oh my God, what will happen when the final whale is killed? What are we going to use in order to read books? Well, it turns out that we found natural gas and oil and coal, and we are able to create electricity to read books without having to kill a lot of whales, right? So that's what's called substitution. And we have no idea where new discoveries are going to come from and which commodities we'll be using in order to, because it doesn't really matter whether you are using whale or whether you're using coal. What you want to do is to read the book. And so the cheapest possible way to get to it is better. It has an environmental added bonus that you don't have to kill beautiful animals.
I like this example that you give with the pizzas, because most of us think in terms of the resources that the earth has to offer are like, one pizza, that as long as we all have to share this one pizza, the pizza gets thinner and thinner and thinner. And the example that you give, or the analogy that you give, is that, having a larger population actually leads us to not having to necessarily take that one pizza and smush it out and share it, but actually there's creations of new pizzas because there's additional people that are problem solving for us. And I think this is something that is very, very difficult for people to grapple with, because it's not intuitive for us to think in terms of the new pizzas that have not emerged into the scene yet, right? We really just think about, well, these are the resources and the needs that we're aware of right now, and therefore we're probably going to need those forever. And you really articulate this pretty well in your book, and also you define superabundance in a way that I think is very helpful to understand how we look at this whole world a little differently, not from the lens of a zero-sum pie, but actually a pie that has opportunity to kind of grow. So can you explain the definition of superabundance and what does that actually mean? And I love your example of the candles and the whales and electricity. So I think that would be really helpful to those listening.
Well, let's start with the pizza example. The point is that there is no fixed sized pizza, and the more people you have, the thinner the slices must get. Pizza can be grown, and it's being grown all the time. One thing that Bill Maher said, which is both true and completely misleading, he said that there is a share of humanity, maybe it was 1 in 4 people, who are going hungry. That is true. But famines no longer exist in the world outside of war zones. In Europe, prior to modernity, you would have a famine almost every 8 years, where often hundreds of thousands, even millions of people died because they literally had no food at all. Today in the world, you still have, you see, they switched the terminology. They no longer talk about starvation and famines. They talk about food insecurity. Yes, it is true that around the world, a share of humanity still has food insecurity. Maybe they cannot eat 3 times a day. Maybe they can eat twice a day. Or in worst case scenario, once a day instead of twice a day. And that, thankfully, is improving. But the point is that people are no longer dying by millions because they have no food at all. So by talking about food insecurity, he is able to mislead people, because in fact, that number actually shows progress. It shows that we are no longer dying because we don't have any food. So he's taking something that is actually very positive and turning it into something negative. A perfect example of growing the pie, that 8 billion people can live in a world where some people may still be hungry, but nobody is dying of hunger, would be like what happened to fertilizer. For thousands of years, we would use human and animal fertilizer, excrement, in order to fertilize our fields, which was incredibly dangerous for a variety of gastrointestinal reasons and so forth. And then in the 19th century, people discovered that there is a lot of fertilizing potential in guano, which is basically bird poopings in South America. So ships from Europe would sail to South America and they would get this guano, which is just fossilized bird poop, and then we would sprinkle it on fields in Europe, and suddenly there would be much more food. But then guano started becoming quite expensive in the mid to late 19th century as we were running out of those deposits, until 2 Germans, Haber and Bosch, came along and decided, why don't we create synthetic fertilizer, which uses natural gas, turns it into ammonia. And right now, something like half of the world is basically being fed through this process of synthetic fertilization. So here you have a case where 2 people have contributed to growing this pie, this pizza pie, much, much bigger. So in this book, we went back all the way to 1850, and we look at hundreds of different commodities: food, fuel, finished goods, and so forth. And we found that all of them are getting cheaper relative to income. So none of them are becoming less abundant. All of them are becoming more abundant. But then we noticed something interesting. You can grow abundance at 2 different speeds: less than population and more than population. So let me explain that. So let's say population in the world is growing at 2% a year, but abundance is growing only at 1% a year. We just call that growth in abundance. It's still growing, right? But what we found is that actually, in every case, abundance is growing at a faster rate than population. So if population is growing at 2%, but your abundance is increasing at 3% or even 3.5%, then that's what we call superabundance. And there's a gap opening up between population, 2%, abundance, 3.5%. And that gap is the new knowledge that is produced in the human mind.
Well, and that gap also reflects the fact that we're all effectively richer, right? I mean, we want a huge gap between our population growth and the abundance of the resources that are made available to us. I think in your book, you mentioned that it's a 1% to 3% ratio. Is that right?
In our book, what we have found is that, contrary to misperception, abundance is increasing at a faster pace than previous decades, meaning we did not see some sort of a secular stagnation that a lot of people are complaining about. What we have seen is that when you compare prices of goods to wages, actually the speed of progress, growth of abundance is increasing rather than decreasing.
How do you measure abundance? How do you measure that? Because in order to put it into a chart, you have to create a measurement for it, right?
That's right. So we measure abundance in time prices. Let me explain what that means. So what we wanted to do, we want to go back in time as far as possible, say 1850 or 1900, whatever. And we are racking our brains. So how are we going to account for inflation and things like that? Because, how do we compare countries against each other? You need exchange rates and purchasing power parities and so on. So instead, what we are using is time prices. What we are saying is, how much did this mug cost in dollars in 1850? And how much was a typical worker, let's say manufacturing laborer, earning per hour in 1850? And once you divide the price by the hourly income, you get hours and minutes of work. So let's say that it cost me an hour of work in 1850 to buy this mug. Then you fast forward to 2020 or 2023. You take the same mug and you ask, how much does it cost and how much am I making per hour? And if suddenly the price falls from 1 hour to 30 minutes, then you are twice as well off. So basically, everything that we measure in superabundance is measured in time prices. The length of time it takes you to earn enough money to be able to buy something. Let me give you a typical example. Over the last 100 years, in the United States, a blue-collar worker, let's say somebody who worked in the Ford factory making
automobiles.
What was it called? The T-type? No, the
Model T.
Model T. In 1919, and you compare that person making a Chevrolet today in the United States. Okay, what we found was that the price of eggs has fallen so much that for the same amount of work that would get 1 egg to the worker in 1919, he can now get 36 eggs today. The same amount of work that would get the manufacturing laborer making a car 1 chicken in 1919 got him 26 chickens in 2019. So this is how we are able to actually calculate how standards of living have improved. It also allows us to do cross-country comparisons. We don't have to do exchange rates between the currency in Japan and China and the United States. We just say, how long does a Chinese laborer or a Japanese laborer have to work? How many minutes to buy this cup? How many minutes does an American worker have to do that? And then you can see how they compare toward each other.
Brilliant. So one of the questions I like to ask when people confront me with ideas that we're hearing through our education system or in the media that are simply wrong is, why are we hearing the wrong things? I know that there is a man by the name of Paul Ehrlich who came up with this idea that there is a population bomb ahead of us. And for some reason, it was his ideas that propagated through our systems, and it's basically what we've come to believe. Why have we not heard Julian Simon's idea? Why are we so focused on this apocalyptic, end of the world, let's not repopulate? Why are we hearing the lies and not the truth?
I think partly because it's dramatic. Drama sells. It's very difficult to make a movie about a happy family where everything is working out. There is no drama. There's nothing to talk about. It's just a normal family. Like 99.99% of all families in the United States today will go to bed having a perfectly normal day. So it's not a story. But if all of them die in a horrible car accident, that suddenly is a story worth reporting in the media. If it bleeds, it leads, right? And during human evolution, we have really evolved to look at the negative because the world was so much less hospitable than it is today. So many things could kill us, eat us, destroy us, that we have evolved to look out for danger. And whereas the world is much more peaceful and much more prosperous and much healthier and better educated today, that is only the story of the last 200 years. So the genes haven't had enough time to change. We are still the Stone Age brain looking out for dangers. We react to that story on TV. Why is it that the newscast at 8 p.m. or 6 p.m. always leads with the most dramatic thing? Because if you want to grab people's attention, you always start with that which is most traumatic. And that is why I think people like Paul Ehrlich had such sway.
So it's our human instinct to actually watch out for danger and also to consider what are the finite resources that we may or may not be able to get a hold of. What did Julian Simon say? Because he had an argument with Paul Ehrlich.
Yeah. So let's start with Paul Ehrlich. In 1968, he wrote a very famous book called Population Bomb. Sold 3 million copies, translated into many languages. As an author, believe me, I would love to sell 3 million copies.
After this episode, they're all going to buy your book.
Please, So the premise of the book was very simple. The population was expanding. After the Second World War, you have all of these independent countries, India, Bangladesh, and so on. Populations are exploding. You have the spread of best practices, better medicine. And Paul Ehrlich is projecting into the future and saying all of these people are going to consume and we are going to run out of food. We are all going to die. Hundreds of millions of people are going to die. Now, the thing is with Paul Ehrlich, he's still alive, by the way. He still teaches at Stanford here in California. And the problem is that he's a biologist. He thinks of us in the same way as all the other animals. Too much food, too much sex between animals, too many babies, too much consumption.
One pizza
collapse, right? And what really made Paul Ehrlich so famous was that he became the most frequent guest on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. And one person watching the show on the other side of the country at the University of Maryland was an economist by the name of Julian Simon. And he couldn't believe what he was hearing because his numbers were telling him the exact opposite, that things were becoming cheaper. So Simon challenged Ehrlich to a bet. Ehrlich, not Simon, Ehrlich would choose 5 commodities over a 10-year period. And if those commodities became cheaper, then Ehrlich would pay Simon. But if they became more expensive, then Simon would pay Ehrlich. They both agreed that there is some sort of relationship between population and resources. Ehrlich was arguing that as population was going to grow, and indeed population over those 10 years grew by 800 million people. Ehrlich argued that as population grew over those 10 years, resources were going to become scarcer and therefore more expensive. Simon was saying no, as population grew over those 10 years, by 800 million, resources were actually going to become cheaper and more abundant. Well, the bet ended in 1990. The bet was from 1980 to 1990. And the 5 commodities fell in average by 36%. So you added 800 million people, but resources fell in price, adjusted for inflation, by 36%. And so Ehrlich had to send Simon a check for something like $576. So Simon won that bet.
So is it possible that the reason, though, that there are so many more resources, even though there's population growth, because of this miracle innovation of fossil fuels becoming part of our agriculture? Is it an anomaly? So much of our way of life is better because of our access to fossil fuels and, the nitrogen being infused into the fertilizer and us having so much more access to food. Is it possible that innovation is an anomaly, or were you able to prove that this is actually something that is continuous with population growth? Because your point is that a larger population means more innovation. And so are you able to, right? That's your point. It's like more people, more innovation.
Yeah.
But not everybody is inventing stuff. And so I'm curious to know whether there's just a spike in the chart that is caused by the introduction of fossil fuels into our lives.
Fossil fuels certainly have played a massive role in powering the Industrial Revolution, primarily with steam. This was a long time before we started using oil or gas very wildly. But they played a role. But one benefit of fossil fuels was not just to power this extraordinary new thing called the Industrial Revolution, but also the fact that we could stop deforestation in Western Europe, where the Industrial Revolution starts. Part of the reason why England had to switch to coal, that then created the fuel for steamships and locomotives, etc., was that they were running out of forests, right? Because in the pre-modern period, everything was done with wood. And then, of course, something like the killing of whales could have been avoided. The extermination could have been avoided because we started using electricity in order to do our lighting and so on. But fossil fuels are only a small part, maybe not such a small part, they're only a part of all the other inventions and innovations that have happened over the last 200 years to keep us well fed, for example. Norman Borlaug, the great agronomist from the United States, who was the father of the Green Revolution and who basically was looking at into different kind of wheat that was much more productive. In other words, switching from one type of wheat through genetic modification or through different types of breeding until you got to the kind of wheat which is much more productive than the ones that we used 100 or 200 years ago. Look at pictures of chickens from 100 years ago, tiny little birds, Now it's just one giant breast walking, about to get slaughtered and turned into sandwiches. The point is that hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people, through making incremental, small contributions to this increase in productivity, have enabled us to live in a world where we can not only feed 8 billion people, but where increasingly they are so well fed that obesity is a bigger problem than starvation. So fossil fuels, yes, they've been very useful, and but many other inventions and innovations that have happened over time have contributed to this massive increase in abundance.
So I got to admit, it took a bit of convincing for me to actually buy into this idea that more humans is a good thing. But I do get it now, because humans are able to, humans are able to provide ingenuity, right? And so through this ingenuity and new technology, we're able to propel ourselves forward and problem solve, et cetera, unlike animals who are
That's
not
right.
necessarily able to do that, right?
That's right. You sometimes see animals trade with each other. You sometimes see them using tools, but they don't, as a general rule, innovate. I think that in the book, something as simple as a chimp cracking a nut with a rock can take up to between 4 and 8 years for the mother to teach its child, whereas a human being can understand this concept almost instantaneously. The point being that in our model, we start with the overall population. Only a small fraction of humanity invents or innovates anything. It's single digits, maybe 6%, maybe 5%. So the bigger the population you have, then the absolute number of people who are going to be inventors or innovators is going to be growing larger with the big population, but the share is always going to remain very small, okay, the percentage. Mm-hmm. And so the bigger population you have, the more people you are going to have who are going to come up with new ideas. And so people come up with new ideas, which then they turn into inventions. But sometimes inventions are bad, sometimes they are good, sometimes they are useless, sometimes they are useful, valuable, not valuable. So that's why you also need the free market to decide which of these inventions is creating new value. And at the end of the process, the perfect example would be something like the BlackBerry versus smartphone, right? You need the marketplace to sort out what is actually a more valuable product. We ended up with smartphones. And at the end of the day, you're going to have a new innovation that increases productivity and therefore standards of living. So that's how it works. You have the largest possible population. The tiny little sliver that produces new ideas remains the same, but the bigger the population, the more people you have, the more innovators you have. And those new ideas are then turned into innovations which increase standard of living. That's how we think about it. And that is why, on average, what I'm saying is that human being innovates more, creates more than they consume. And we know that. We know that. We can show that. If the listener or the viewer thinks about it for just a nanosecond, they will understand this. At the time of Thomas Jefferson, President 1800, there was 1 billion people in the world. The world was incredibly poor. Today, there's 8 billion of us. And compared to people in 1800, we are incredibly rich. So just based on that one statistic, it should be obvious that more people create a better world.
Do you think that somebody listening would say, yeah, well, it's true that we have more people today than we did in the past, but certain cultures have innovated more than others. So let's take China. There are a lot of people living in China. Are they innovating as much as other countries? And do we need to factor other elements into what actually catapults superabundance? Is it just more humans, or are there other factors that help with that?
Yes.
You mentioned, the free market as an example. It doesn't seem like it's just one variable of having enough people. It's enough people plus a few other elements, right?
Definitely. If population was all that mattered, the book is devoted toward the argument that having more people is not a bad thing. We hope that we have succeeded in saying that. But if more people was all that was needed to create abundance, then China would have been the richest country in the world for 2,500 years. China becomes a unified entity in 221 BC. So for 2,200 years, it is the most populous country in the world. But with a few exceptions, like the 12th century, when China actually does become quite prosperous for its time, China is actually a very poor place. And China only grows to the economic giant that we know today when communism proper ends in 1978. Yes, I know Communist Party is still in charge, but Communist Party today is a very different animal from Communist Party during the time of Mao Zedong. During the time of Mao killed 45 million people. Today in China is still a brutal authoritarianship, but people have more freedom and more certainty in their lives than they did when Mao was in charge. And after China started liberalizing somewhat, this unleashed this extraordinary potential of 1.4 billion people so that they could create this modern and prosperous China that we know today. So yes, superabundance very much depends on the total number of people and the innovators that emerge from that, but they must also be free to think, to speak, to publish, and then to invest and profit from their inventions. If you have all the people, but they are not free to give flight to their ideas, then number of people doesn't matter.
So, your formula is that we need a larger population and a freer population, and that will essentially solve many of the problems that we are not even aware of yet that might emerge into the future. Are we doing the opposite in America today? I mean, it seems like, you watched Bill Maher's episode, and you hear this all over the place where people are told that they should have less children because it's going to impact the globe, right? Global warming. And we're also told that we should have less capitalism, less economic freedom. All of these things that you're saying are part of the formula that has led to prosperity. It does seem like we're going a little backwards. And why do you think we're doing this to ourselves?
Well, speaking globally, it's technically possible that you could have stable population or even slightly decreasing population. But so long as the share of people who live in freedom is expanding globally again, then we can still maintain our economic growth rate and perhaps even improve on it. But that's not the way that the world is going. Political and economic freedom are actually declining. I think the peak freedom around the world, as we measure it, my colleague Ian Vasquez measures it in his freedom index. The peak freedom around the world was, I think, in 2007. And since then, economic and political freedom around the world are actually on the decline. So what we could see in the future is that the world's population starts declining. After about 2060, the world's population is going to start declining. And also, fewer people are going to be living in freedom. And if that happens, then of course, that would have very deleterious consequences for economic growth. Here in our country, the United States is still growing in terms of population. Native-born American women have about 1.7 children per lifetime. You need 2.1 to keep population stable. So that's called the replacement ratio, 2.1. Native-born American women have about 1.7, which is not great, but it's their choice. But the population keeps on growing because of immigration, right? So our population is probably going to continue to increase. But of course, our freedom is decreasing, both economically and also measures of liberal democracy, trust in the elections, trust in institutions are all on the decrease. And when it comes to the economic system as a whole, obviously, I think that Mara sometimes has these sort of socialist impulses, but ultimately he has come out as a pro-capitalist, which is great, so long as you understand that that it's not a capitalist economy where a bunch of bureaucrats in Washington decide who wins in the market, who loses in the market, who should be given multi-billion-dollar subsidies, who should be punished or shut down. And that is increasingly what we see in our economy is a heavy involvement of the political class in decision-making, where the money flows, how it is used, who should benefit, who should suffer, and that sort of thing.
Environmental social governance, where the government gets to take away our freedoms and essentially pick winners and losers, and really focus on, let's talk about the environmental element, because that's a big part of your book. I mean, you continuously talk about what has led to innovation is having independence and access to fossil fuels and natural gas and all of those things. But we're actually seeing more rules and regulations that are not allowing Americans to use the technology that catapults us into prosperity. And so, what is your reaction to that? Why are we being taught that the technologies that have catapulted us are actually bad for us and bad for the climate?
Well, actually, in the video, that brings me to another point, which is deeply misleading in what Bill said. He was implying that people all over the world are suffering as a result of climate change. Mm-hmm. The climate is changing. The world is lukewarming. It is becoming warmer, not by any stretch of imagination as fast as the extreme environmentalists are claiming, but it is becoming slightly warmer. But the number of people who are dying as a result of climate change is dropping like a stone. Over the last 100 years, the number of people who have died due to floods, earthquakes, tsunamis, heat waves,
freezing
has dropped by 99%. So, when the extreme environmentalists talk about an existential crisis, what I see is a problem that can be solved through, for example, building more nuclear power stations, which do not emit anything, which don't emit any CO2 into the atmosphere. I do not see an existential crisis because I ask myself, existential for whom? Yeah. Well, it's obvious that it's existential for human beings, right? They are claiming that if things go as they are going, humanity will cease to exist because of climate change. But so far, we have seen the number of people dying due to climate change, due to extreme weather, actually decreasing. So where is the data showing that there is an existential crisis coming out of climate change? So far, it's not there. We are safer than we have ever been from extreme weather. Why? Well, first of all, we have sturdier buildings. We no longer live in shacks, so that when a hurricane comes, we all go on flying like Dorothy. Instead, we can withstand extreme weather because we have better buildings. We have sensors at the bottom of the sea and in the oceans that will inform us about a potential earthquake or a volcanic eruption in the middle of the ocean. So that gives us time to warn people living on islands or in low-lying areas to move to higher ground. We have satellites which tell us with some precision which way the hurricane or the tornado will be going, so that we can warn people, sometimes day in advance, that they should vacate areas where danger may be lurking. So I don't see an existential crisis. I see a problem that, yes, ideally we would stop producing more CO2 into the atmosphere. I see a solution, which could include building more nuclear power stations. And instead, what we get from the extreme environmentalist is always no. Let me give you an example. I mean, the nuclear power is one perfect example. You have a solution, tried and tested, that could resolve their main issue, which is CO2. They say no. Okay. You have the concern of the biosphere, which is to say the environmentalists want as much of the world to be protected from human exploitation so that it can be enjoyed by animals and flora. So people like me come along and say, well, we could solve this by having genetically modified organisms, food, that we can grow better plants that don't need much water. They don't need so much fertilizer. They don't need so many pesticides. We can genetically modify them so that they are really sturdy and that deliver huge yield per acre of land. And then we can return the rest of nature back to animals. The answer is no.
Why are they so anti-technology?
Because they are not looking for a solution. For them, environmentalism is not so much a care about the planet, I'm convinced.
It's like not the religion of green, basically?
It's a replacement for a religion. It's a secular religion. Everybody needs to believe something in their lives, searching for some sense of the transcendental. And for a lot of people, I think, the belief in Mother Gaia, the unspoiled, virginal Mother Earth, has replaced the belief in the Garden of Eden.
And so they're so committed to this belief that they actually don't want to accept new technologies.
No, and if an apocalypse came, if you take out all the possible solutions that techno-optimists like myself are arguing for, then of course you are hastening the moment of the apocalypse. Mm-hmm. And that's also good for them, because if you do have an apocalypse, then that would only reaffirm that the beliefs which they held were the correct ones.
It's interesting that you have the instinct to pick that up, because you grew up in a communist country where they were very anti-God and very anti-religion. And, you know, from my understanding, the big rebels were the ones who went to church, right? And when you come here to the United States, it's almost like you can immediately identify these new religions where people are so committed to this environmentalist religion, and they have their priests and they have their gathering and their saints and the devils and all of that. Do you think that's what helps you kind of like see that so clearly? Where, you know, is it somewhat similar to that big government that communism sold people when they removed God from their lives?
Well, I think that human psychology is more important here than necessarily the economic system. One of the dark secrets that the environmentalists don't talk about is that socialist and communist countries have been much more devastating to the environment than capitalist countries. What the Soviet bloc looked like after communism collapsed from an environmental standpoint, I mean, books and hundreds of papers have been written about it. Communists didn't care one whit about the environment. Capitalists are much better at protecting the environment, partly because private property, people do care about things that belong to them.
Yeah.
If nothing belongs to anyone, nobody cares.
Yeah.
But more to your point, no, I think that much more important is human psychology. We are a strange animal. We foresee our own demise. No other animal does that. We foresee the end. And so in order to make some sense of life, we continue to strive for the transcendental. We have to have meaning in our lives. Some people get it from God. Other people get it from work. Other people get it from family. Sometimes you get it from all three. And sometimes you get it from a cultish belief in Mother Gaia. But everybody needs some sort of a story they tell themselves about being in this universe and what does it all mean. Very few people are satisfied with having no story at all.
Yeah, I totally follow you on this one. It's like if you come to believe in nothing, then you'll end up believing in anything. Is that what Chesterton said?
G.K. Chesterton's famous phrase, yeah.
And so this is why I want to pitch you on adding another element to this idea of superabundance, where you say that in order to have superabundance and, access to all this technology and innovation, you need to have a large and growing population because it's human ingenuity that creates it. And then you also say that we need freedom in order for capitalism to flow and for the market to wrestle with the good ideas and the bad ideas. And my pitch is to actually add a third element to it. And that is when it comes to the issue of morality and ethics. And if people don't have meanings in their lives, this large population can very quickly be hijacked to believe in meaningless things, which is, I think, what we're seeing. The world is falling into this kind of trap. And so wanted to just kind of wrestle this idea with you a little bit on how important it is that we do have meaning in our lives. So we don't have a God-sized hole in our hearts that takes our attention away from productivity and actually focuses on, catapulting our quality of life.
I'm not a philosopher, but I do understand where you're coming from. I've spent the last 20 years, I've spent the last 30 years appreciating capitalism, and I've spent the last 20 years defending it. And there is a moral component to capitalism, which is that if you do it right, you make a lot of money by supplying your fellow human beings with what they want. But that element of capitalism, whilst it is moral and very important, is not sufficient. If somebody wishes to be supplied, for example, with pedophilic images, then you, as an entrepreneur, as a capitalist, must say, I could make a lot of money by providing a service, but I'm not going to do it because there is a higher morality which says that providing pedophilia would be unacceptable and wrong. So there is a scope within society for some overarching sense of morality of what is right and what is wrong. As a non-philosopher, I cannot tell you what that philosophical system or ethical system should be, but there is definitely need for one. And I think that part of the problem of the last 10 or 15 years has been that there is no longer anyone out there making a case for a moral code of conduct or an ethical code of conduct. Everything has become relativistic, and people who do say openly that they believe that certain way of conducting your life is better than the other are considered to be oppressive, or they are considered to be
bigots,
oppressive or bigoted or whatever. Now, I'm not saying that. Perhaps even you and I would disagree on what that overarching moral ethic should be. But I do think that having that conversation and having more people opine on it and not being afraid to say, I think this is an ethical way to conduct yourself rather than another, would be quite beneficial to society.
I have another controversial question for you. Just as we come towards the end of our chat, throwing in a few more knowledge bombs at you. So I listened to Peter Thiel and read some of his commentary recently, and he's a little down on technology and innovation right now. I think of you as Mr. Happy Guy. All the charts are going up in your book. And I'm curious, what is your take on this claim that the West is actually slowing down in its development of new technologies that are helpful to our way of life?
Well, Peter, who I think is a great entrepreneur, and I like him immensely, but he doesn't like this book, The Superabundance, actually, he said it publicly. But Peter said that famously, we wanted flying cars and we got 140 characters. In other words, his point was that we are making very little progress in terms of atoms, hard, physical stuff, but we are making a lot of progress in terms of bits. Bits meaning electronics. Okay, so a lot of development in information technology and so on, not so much in sort of physical stuff. Now, in this book, Superabundance, we'll look at 168 years of data, and what we show is that there is still a lot of progress happening in the world of atoms. We are still creating a lot more value. We are still innovating our way towards ever cheaper production of food and fuel and natural resources, and actually that the speed of innovation, according to our numbers, is actually going up rather than down. Tyler Cowen, a very famous American economist, very well-regarded American economist, wrote a book about the Great Stagnation back in 2011. In the last 2 or 3 years, he has changed his mind completely. He thinks that we are on the verge of tremendous economic and technological flourishing in the United States because of tremendous improvements in artificial intelligence, because of tremendous improvement in GPT, and so on. And so I think that there is a good chance that Peter will change his tune in the next 10 years. And this is my public challenge to him, that we should have a bet on whether the speed of progress is going to increase or not. I'm willing to put a few $1,000s behind it.
So you mentioned AI and ChatGPT. Do you think it's a good thing? I know a lot of people are quite worried about it.
From personal experience, I use ChatGPT all the time now. In the old days, if I wanted to find a bit of information, I would have to go on Google, and often it would take hours to get finally to the article that had a clear answer to the question that I was asking. With ChatGPT, this can get down to seconds. So I no longer ask Google for answers to my questions. I ask ChatGPT. You have to keep an eye out on it. We are already seeing different ChatGPTs emerging all over. They will be competing with one another. Different algorithms are going to be providing different sort of answers, etc. But I think it's a tremendous productivity enhancing technology, and I'm looking forward to it getting better.
Yeah, I guess somebody would say that ChatGPT is, skewed philosophically or ideologically in a certain direction, but you would say the same thing about Google if that's what we're researching, right?
Yes, and the good thing is that, of course, we are going to have a lot of these programs,
right? And they'll compete,
and you don't have to people will need to wise up very quickly. There is going to be a set of questions that you are going to ask ChatGPT, and if it gives you answers that you hate, you're going to try something else until you get to a place that seems reasonable, and then you're going to be using that engine. And so before you know it, people who are currently using ChatGPT in order to push a certain type of ideology will have to realize that actually providing a much more objective product is the way that they can, is the only way that they can survive.
And though that's how they'll get most of the market.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I promised my team that this is going to be the uplifting interview, because a lot of our interviews are really hard to digest, things that we've, really misunderstood, and we've been misinformed and we've been lied to about. So I want to end it with something positive. Let's go back to what I call your happy book, which shows all these incredible global trends. And if you could choose one chart and one global trend that you want to end this with, so people who walk away just can put a smile on their face that we're living in the best country, but also the best time to be alive as a human, which chart would you choose to tell us about?
Well, I do believe that we live in the best times, and they could be much, much better. That is not to say that we still don't have a lot of problems that we can improve on. But I think the most important one that really underpins everything is life expectancy. Life expectancy, because if you're not alive, if you are dead, then nothing else matters. So the point is that when I think it was
57.
Was it?
Right.
56, I think.
Yeah.
May have been.
There it is.
There we go. So living longer is a proxy for all sorts of things. It is a proxy for living in more peaceful times, that we are not slaughtering each other all the time. It is a proxy for better diet. It is a proxy for collapsing maternal and infant mortality. It is a proxy basically for a better world. And as far as we can tell, going back 10,000 years, but you could go back 100,000 or 200,000 years, life expectancy usually was about 25 years. Okay? Some people lived to a ripe old age, but most people died. Life expectancy was about 25 years. Now, globally, it is 73 years. And that's remarkable because in 1900, when Theodore Roosevelt was president, in the richest countries in the world, life expectancy was 50. Today, it is 73. And so we have all of this additional time to explore the world, to explore relationships, to play sports, to learn new things, to travel, to spend time with our families. And for that, I'm truly grateful.
Well, Marian, thank you. And may you continue to do great work, and wishing you a long, prosperous life.
Thank you very much. Thank you. L'chaim.